Get on your knees, Grandma. A 72-year-old black woman is slammed against a police cruiser, her ID crushed under a boot. Laughter follows. They think she's a fraud. But 15 minutes later, sirens wail, federal agents land, and the woman they humiliated? She's the Attorney General's mother. And she pressed the panic button. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The morning sun spilled across the quiet street as Margaret Thompson smoothed her skirt and adjusted the clasp of her pearl necklace. At 72, she carried herself with the grace of someone who believed in order, dignity, and the power of routine. Her blouse was pressed so crisply it could have been lifted from a department store mannequin. Her small gold watch gleamed on her wrist, and her shoes clicked confidently against the wooden floor as she made her way through her modest home. This was not a day she had planned with frivolity. It had purpose. She had told herself the night before that she would move deliberately, calmly, and without a single misstep. Her grandson's tuition payment was due, and she was going to withdraw the money in person, as she always had, from the account she had faithfully maintained for over 4 decades. She paused at her dining table, where an envelope waited, containing carefully written notes. Margaret had written out the figures: tuition balance, room and board, incidental fees. She had checked it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it into her purse, alongside her identification, her checkbook, and the slim phone her son had given her as a gift the previous year. The phone was no ordinary model. It carried a button her son insisted she keep with her at all times. "Emergencies only, Mom," he had told her. "It connects directly to me." She had chuckled at the time, telling him she wasn't prone to emergencies. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't fragile. She was steady, composed, and careful. Today, of all days, would prove how little control one can have when others decide your worth before you speak. She locked her front door, the metal of the key cold in her hand. Her small sedan, years old but well kept, started with a low hum. She drove through the quiet streets of the town she had lived in for more than 30 years. She passed children walking to school, mothers holding toddlers by the hand, and shopkeepers rolling up shutters. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary town, and Margaret believed it would remain that way. She parked in the lot of First National Bank, adjusted her purse strap, and caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her hair was pinned neatly, silver strands swept elegantly back. She whispered a small affirmation to herself. This was a simple errand, nothing more. Inside the branch, the air was cool, and the soft hum of printers filled the silence between cheerful greetings. A young white couple stood at the counter, laughing with the teller who shook their hands warmly as he passed back their paperwork. Margaret waited her turn, standing tall though she felt the familiar ache in her knees. The teller, whose name tag read Brian, glanced up at her, his expression flattening. The warmth he had offered the couple before her vanished as though someone had pulled a curtain across his face. "Next," he said, his tone clipped, transactional. Margaret stepped forward, offering him her most professional smile. "Good morning. I'd like to withdraw $15,000 from my account." Brian's eyebrows shot up slightly, though he quickly tried to mask it. She slid her bank card and identification across the counter. He picked them up, staring at the driver's license longer than was necessary, then flicked his eyes from the card to Margaret's face, back to the card, then again to her face. 15,000, he repeated, as though she might correct herself. "Yes," she said firmly, "for my grandson's tuition." Brian didn't respond immediately. He kept turning the card over in his hand, squinting at the edges, and Margaret felt a small irritation rise in her chest. She had completed countless transactions at this bank. She had been a loyal client for decades. Yet the way he was studying her identification, one would think she had handed him a counterfeit bill. "I'm going to need to check something," he muttered finally, lowering his voice as he leaned toward a colleague 2 windows down. That colleague, the branch manager Sandra, was a woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a mouth that seemed always on the edge of disapproval. Brian whispered to her while holding Margaret's identification loosely in his hand. Margaret straightened her back, refusing to shrink into the uncomfortable silence. "Is there a problem with my request?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with impatience. Sandro approached slowly, folding her arms across her chest. She looked Margaret over, her gaze not neutral but heavy with a sort of quiet judgment. "Mrs. Thompson, we just have a few fraud prevention measures we need to run. Large withdrawals often raise flags, especially—" She hesitated, just enough for the pause to sting. "Especially with accounts like yours." Margaret's eyebrows drew together. "Accounts like mine? I've banked here longer than some of your staff have been alive. What exactly is the issue?" Sandra pursed her lips, her voice patronizing. "We simply need to be thorough. It protects people like you." The words landed with weight. Margaret tilted her chin upward. "People like me," she repeated softly, as if testing the sound. Sandra said nothing more, only turned and carried Margaret's identification and bank card into a back office. Margaret exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. She remembered her son's voice at Christmas, a voice she had brushed aside at the time. "Mom, sometimes people won't see your worth until you show them. Don't let them shrink you." She had laughed it off then, insisting that respect came naturally when one carried themselves properly. Standing in this bank, watched by strangers who seemed to sense the tension but said nothing, she realized her son had been warning her about moments exactly like this. Through the glass of the office door, she could see Sandra gesturing toward the bank's security guard. The guard lifted his head and looked at Margaret, then back at Sandra, then nodded as he reached for a phone at his belt. Margaret's stomach tightened. She clutched her purse more firmly, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of her emergency phone. She had never once thought she might need it in a place like this. Margaret stood at the counter, her back straight and her shoulders squared. Around her, the flow of the bank continued, though there was an unmistakable shift in the air. Customers seemed to glance her way more often, whispering quietly to one another. A woman who had been filling out a deposit slip slowed her writing, eyes darting to the glass office where Sandra had disappeared. A young man waiting in line pretended to check his watch, though his gaze lingered on Margaret's composed figure. The teller beside Brian offered service to another customer with forced cheerfulness, his eyes flicking nervously toward Margaret every few moments. Brian himself avoided her gaze now, tapping at his computer with exaggerated focus, as though the machine demanded all his attention. Margaret knew the look of avoidance. It was the same one students had given her decades ago when she had been a teacher and asked a question they hadn't prepared for. They avoided eye contact because they knew they were complicit in something they didn't want to acknowledge. Margaret drew in a measured breath. "Brian," she said evenly, "I expect my documents to be returned to me immediately. I have done nothing wrong. I am here to make a legal withdrawal from my own account." He glanced at her briefly, color rising in his cheeks. "Please wait just a moment, ma'am. Manager's orders." Her lips pressed together tightly. "Manager's orders," she repeated, letting the words roll off her tongue like they tasted sour. Behind the office window, she saw Sandra still speaking into the phone while gesturing at her. The security guard leaned against the wall, eyes narrowed, and his lips moved as he spoke quietly into his shoulder radio. Margaret understood what was happening, though no one had spoken the words aloud yet. They were treating her not as a client, not as a woman of standing and dignity, but as a suspect. Her hand tightened on her purse. Inside it, her emergency phone rested like a hidden lifeline. She had scoffed when her son had insisted she keep it. Who would need a panic button in a quiet suburban bank? Yet now, as she felt the weight of suspicion pressing against her chest, she recognized its value. She looked down briefly, whispering to herself, "Show them." Her son's voice echoed in memory. "People won't always see your worth until you show them." She lifted her head again, eyes clear, spine tall. Whatever happened next, she would not allow them to strip her of the dignity she had built over 72 years. Margaret did not flinch when the office door finally opened and Sandra stepped out, her arms crossed tightly, her expression sharp. Sandra nodded once to the security guard. The guard spoke into his radio again. Outside, the faint sound of sirens began to rise in the distance, and Margaret's hand remained steady on her purse strap. The day had shifted. What began as a simple transaction was about to become something much larger. The first wail of sirens cut through the stillness of the morning, and every head inside the bank turned toward the glass doors. Margaret did not flinch. She stood where she was, her back straight, her purse gripped tightly in her hand. Customers pressed closer to the windows, whispering, pointing, their curiosity swelling into a low buzz. 2 cruisers pulled into the lot, tires grinding against asphalt, lights flashing though no emergency had truly occurred. Out stepped 2 officers, both white men with the kind of swagger that announced their authority before a single word left their mouths. Officer Daniels, taller, broad-shouldered, with a sharp jaw and clipped movements, led the way. Behind him, Officer Miller, stockier, younger, carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had grown accustomed to watching others bend beneath his presence. They entered the bank, their boots heavy against the tile. The air shifted instantly. Conversations stopped, pens hovered mid-signature, and the customers who had been murmuring moments earlier now stood frozen. Sandra, the manager, pointed immediately, her arm extended like an accusation in a courtroom. "That's the one," she said, her voice clipped with certainty. Margaret held her ground as both men fixed their eyes on her. Daniel strode forward, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Ma'am, we need you to step outside with us," he said, his tone already heavy with presumption. Margaret's voice was calm, even, her dignity intact despite the heat rising in her chest. "I have done nothing wrong. I am here to withdraw money from my own account." Miller let out a sharp laugh. "Let's not make a scene in front of all these nice people," he sneered. "Or do you want cuffs right here in the lobby?" The threat hovered in the air like smoke. Some of the customers looked away, unwilling to witness what might come next. Others stared, wide-eyed, cell phones beginning to rise from purses and pockets. Margaret inhaled deeply, gathering her composure, then turned and walked toward the doors, flanked by Daniels and Miller. She walked tall, but inside her stomach coiled with dread. Outside, the heat of the morning pressed against her skin. The parking lot, once an ordinary stretch of asphalt, now felt like a stage with too many eyes watching from behind the glass. Daniels positioned himself to her right, Miller to her left, closing the circle around her with the precision of men who thought they owned every inch of space they stepped into. The cruiser's hood gleamed under the sunlight, and Margaret stood before it as the officers began their questions, not inquiring, but accusing. "Several fraud cases have popped up recently involving elderly accounts," Daniels said, his voice flat, his eyes narrowing as though she had already confessed. Margaret's chest tightened, but her voice did not shake. "I am simply withdrawing money for my grandson's tuition. I have the right to access my funds." Miller circled closer, tilting his head as though studying an insect under glass. "You know, ma'am, these scammers are clever. They use fake names, fake documents, fake everything. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Which one do you prefer?" Margaret's pulse throbbed in her throat. She reached slowly into her purse, her movements deliberate, careful, every gesture clear. "I have additional identification," she said, her voice steady but low. "My passport. I will show it to you." The moment her hand moved into her bag, Miller barked, his hand darting toward his holster. "Hands where we can see them! Don't move!" Margaret froze, her hand trembling just above the purse lining. She lifted her gaze, locking eyes with him. "I am reaching for my passport," she said slowly, each syllable sharp as glass. "I am moving slowly. Do not mistake me." Daniels gestured impatiently. "Go on then, but keep it slow." Margaret eased the passport from her purse, holding it up with both hands, offering it like evidence in a trial. The document was genuine, pristine, her photograph crisp against the page. She handed it toward Daniels, who barely looked before tossing it toward Miller. Miller flipped it open, glanced, and smirked. Could be fake, too. You'd be surprised how good forgeries are these days. Margaret's breath hitched. For the first time, a crack threatened her composure. "That is a United States passport," she said, her voice low but sharp. "It is valid and current. You have no reason to dismiss it." Daniels tilted his head, mocking. "Everyone has a reason to lie, ma'am. Everyone has someone to vouch for them. You got a son you want us to call who's going to make it all better?" The words cut deeper than the heat of the sun, deeper than the circle of humiliation tightening around her. She thought of Elijah, of the Christmas conversation, of his quiet insistence that one day she would need to show them who she was. She swallowed hard, forcing down the sting of helplessness. Inside the bank, faces pressed against the glass, watching the scene unfold as if it were some grim play staged for their entertainment. None intervened. None stepped outside. They watched as Margaret's dignity was put on trial in the parking lot she had walked across without fear only minutes before. The officers shifted closer, and Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. Miller's hand darted forward, seizing her purse. "You have no right," she said firmly, her voice trembling at the edges. "Obstruction," Miller muttered coldly, "is cause enough." Daniels yanked the strap, ripping the purse from her grasp, and dumped its contents across the cruiser's gleaming hood. One by one, the tokens of her life scattered like debris, tissues folded neatly in their packet, a tube of lipstick worn down to its base, her reading glasses in a soft cloth case, her wallet heavy with cards, her small framed family photo. The frame slid across the hood, the photo within it smiling up from behind glass. Margaret reached instinctively, her hand trembling, to catch it. Miller stepped into her path. "Don't touch anything," he snapped. The frame slipped, tumbled off the hood, and shattered on the pavement. The glass cracked with a sound that pierced her chest. She looked down at the image, her late husband's steady gaze, her son Elijah's strong smile, frozen in a family portrait. The photo lay face up, amid shards of glass, a symbol of everything she had built, everything she had loved, now treated as debris. "That's my family," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. Daniels crouched over her wallet, pulling out cards, examining each one with theatrical scrutiny. "Social Security cards don't look like this anymore," he said, holding hers between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "Could be forged." Margaret's hands shook, though she clasped them together to hide it. "That card was issued in 1968, she replied quietly, her voice regaining steel. "It is authentic." Miller smirked, grinding his heel into her driver's license where it had fallen. "This account's too big for someone like you," he sneered, pressing down until the plastic bent beneath his weight. The word struck harder than the sound of glass breaking. Her account, her hard-earned savings, decades of labor and sacrifice, all dismissed with a single cruel line, "Too big for someone like you." The echo of it pulsed in her ears, a refrain meant to shrink her existence into suspicion and scorn. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, fighting to hold her dignity intact even as it slipped like sand between her fingers. She thought of the years spent balancing budgets, raising her son, tutoring students, teaching financial literacy to anyone who would listen. She thought of the quiet strength she had always believed was enough to protect her, and she realized with painful clarity that these men had decided who she was long before she opened her mouth. Her voice, when it came again, was steadier than they deserved. "You will regret this," she said softly, not as a threat, but as a truth waiting to arrive. The laughter from Officer Miller rang out across the parking lot, loud and careless, as if this moment, this humiliation, meant nothing to him. Margaret stood silently beside the police cruiser, the broken photo of her family at her feet. Her purse, once neatly packed, had been ransacked, her identity questioned, her dignity fractured. But her hands, though trembling, were not without purpose. Beneath the quiet fire in her chest, she remembered the phone, the one Elijah gave her last year. "Only for emergencies, Mom," he'd said. "Real emergencies. If you ever feel unsafe, press and hold for 3 seconds. I'll know. She had rolled her eyes at the time, teasing him. I raised you on a schoolteacher's salary. You don't think I can handle a trip to the bank? But today, standing in the open air with 2 white officers tearing her apart in front of a growing crowd, she understood why he'd insisted. Her fingers, still near her purse, found the phone. The screen was dark, tucked inside the inner lining, just beneath the flap. She looked at the officers, ensuring their attention was elsewhere. Miller was still sorting through her belongings, muttering under his breath. Daniels had turned to check his radio. Margaret moved slowly, carefully, her fingers pressing the smooth button in the center of the phone's body. 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. A barely perceptible vibration, that was all. No sound, no lights, but the call had connected. Someone was listening. Strachan thought. Darling's eyes were on him, through the ghoulish mask. The officers didn't notice, but someone did. Thousands of miles away, inside a federal building in Washington, D.C., a national security briefing was underway. The conference table was lined with high-ranking officials. At its center sat U.S. Attorney General Elijah Thompson, his eyes focused on a document summarizing cyber threats from foreign entities. He had a pen in his hand and a dozen priorities on his plate. But when his aide Allison opened the door and walked directly into the secure room, he knew something was wrong. She never interrupted mid-briefing, never without cause. "Sir," she said, leaning toward him, "it's your mother. Her emergency channel was activated. Audio is live." Elijah didn't respond at first. He simply blinked, frozen. Then he stood. "Stop the briefing," he ordered. "Now." A hush fell over the room as Allison handed him a tablet already connected to the line. Elijah put in a discreet earpiece, pressed play, and listened. His mother's voice came through first, calm and controlled, but with tension underneath. Then came the officers' voices, sarcastic, mocking. He heard one say, "This account's too big for someone like you." Another voice said, "Let's call your magical son who's going to fix everything." A third voice, the unmistakable sound of Miller, laughed as something clattered against metal. There was a pause. Then he heard his mother say softly, "You will regret this." Elijah's jaw clenched. Every expression in the room shifted as they watched him rip the earpiece out and straighten his back. "Get me the police chief of Pine Ridge County on the line right now," Elijah said, already moving. His staff knew better than to ask questions. He reached for his suit jacket, pulling it on as he strode down the hallway, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Contact the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. Full mobilization. I want a plane on standby within 10 minutes. Wheels up in 30. Allison followed quickly behind. "Sir, do you want to wait for the verification team?" "No," he said without breaking stride. "That was my mother's voice. That was real. I want state coordination notified. I want federal presence at that site. This isn't just personal, it's civil rights. This is systemic rot, caught in real time." A junior staffer appeared at the end of the hallway. "Should we inform the press?" "Not yet," Elijah replied, stopping for a brief moment as he faced his assembled aides. "Right now, I'm not the Attorney General, I'm a son, and I'm going to get my mother." His motorcade pulled up moments later. Black SUVs gleamed beneath the DC sunlight. Secret Service and DOJ staff loaded bags, devices, documents. By the time the plane lifted off the runway at Andrews Air Force Base, Elijah was already drafting the official statement. He didn't need to embellish. The facts spoke for themselves. A 72-year-old black woman, law-abiding, long-time customer, had been detained, searched, and humiliated in public for daring to access her own money. The photos were already flooding social media. Someone had filmed it, of course they had. Margaret's image, dignified, upright, surrounded by officers, was now plastered with captions like, "This is America, banking while black, she's somebody's mother." And they didn't even know whose mother, yet Back on the ground in the sun-soaked parking lot of First National Bank, the tension had shifted, but only slightly. The officers were growing bored, not realizing the storm that was now racing toward them at 30,000 feet. Miller crouched beside the cruiser, holding up the cracked family photo. He turned it toward Margaret with a sneer. "This your real family?" he asked. "Or just a prop for sympathy?" Daniels chuckled from beside him. "Let me guess, this kid's a lawyer or some senator you think we're supposed to be scared of?" Margaret said nothing for a moment. She reached down, slowly picking up the shattered frame. Her hand trembled, but her spine remained straight. "That's my son," she said finally, brushing a shard of glass away with care. "And yes, you'll meet him soon." The officers shared a glance. They didn't laugh this time. Miller opened his mouth, but the sound of incoming messages buzzed from his radio, interrupting him. Inside the bank, Sandra and Brian stood at the window, watching the interaction unfold. Brian shifted uncomfortably. "She's been a client here longer than I've been alive," he muttered. "Why didn't we just verify her account and let her be?" Sandra scoffed. "She matched a fraud profile. Don't get soft now." But Brian's conscience had already started ticking. Margaret held the photo frame gently, now wrapped in the edge of a tissue from her purse. Her fingers brushed against the faces frozen in that image. Her late husband, steady and calm, and Elijah, fresh out of law school, beaming with quiet confidence. Daniels had stepped away to speak into his radio, his voice low and hurried. Margaret noticed the shift in his posture. His shoulders had dropped slightly, his eyes flicking more often to the crowd behind the glass. People were filming now, not just one or two, but a dozen. Customers, bank employees, bystanders from the street. Some stood silently, others whispered to one another. The performance the officers had staged was no longer private. She straightened her spine again, feeling the weight of every second. She could feel her son now, not just as her child, but as the powerful man he had become. She had raised him to believe in justice, in process, in the power of patience and precision. But beneath his calm exterior lived a fire, and she knew it had been lit. Back inside the bank, the manager from headquarters had arrived. He stormed into the lobby, demanding to know what had happened. Brian spoke quickly. "Mrs. Thompson's account is legitimate, premium level, over $1 million. "What?" the manager asked, eyes wide. "Why wasn't this cleared before police got involved?" Brian hesitated. Sandra flagged her. The manager turned to Sandra. "On what grounds?" "She matched a fraud profile," Sandra said weakly. "She wanted to withdraw a large sum." The manager's expression twisted in disbelief. "You mean because she's black, elderly, and asked for her own money?" Sandra stammered, her voice cracking. "That's not what I—" "Save it," he snapped. "We're in the middle of a disaster." Outside, Margaret watched as Daniels returned to her side. He didn't speak. His expression was tighter now, less smug. Something was changing. The certainty had drained from his eyes. "What's wrong, officer?" she asked softly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He didn't respond. He checked his phone, frowned, and then turned away again. Miller paced, his jaw tight, confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. It wasn't just the phones recording them now. It was the silence. The growing awareness from the crowd that what they were witnessing wasn't just unfortunate, it was unjust. The glass between them and the public wasn't thick enough to mute the truth anymore. Miles above the clouds, Elijah's plane began its descent. He looked out the window, jaw clenched, heart burning with fury, not just for his mother, but for what her experience represented. He picked up the intercom. "The moment we land, I want direct contact with the Pine Ridge Police Department. No intermediaries. And I want DOJ representatives posted outside the bank. We're not walking into this quiet." On the ground, Margaret held the photo close to her chest and stared into the eyes of the officers who had treated her like a criminal. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The reckoning had already begun. Officer Daniels stood stiff beside the patrol car, his fingers clenching and unclenching at his sides. The weight of his badge, once a symbol of his control, now seemed heavier. Something had changed. He couldn't name it yet, but it pressed down like a storm hanging just beyond the horizon. Margaret Thompson hadn't moved. She stood silently, the shattered photo cradled in her hand, her expression unreadable. "You're making a mistake," she said, not loudly, but with a certainty that cut through the tension like a blade. Daniels turned, radio crackling in his hand. He pressed the button with more force than necessary, requesting backup. Situation escalating at First National. Suspect resisting ID verification. Possible fraud case. The line clicked in response. Unit 47 en route. Officer Johnson responding. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Suspect," she repeated. "You'll regret using that word." Daniels didn't reply. His eyes scanned the gathering crowd behind the bank's glass wall. Too many phones, too many witnesses. The situation was slipping out of his grip. A few minutes later, a third cruiser rolled up. Officer Johnson stepped out, younger than the other two, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. He walked up slowly, his brows drawn. "What have we got?" he asked. Daniels nodded toward Margaret. Large withdrawal, flagged ID, uncooperative, possibly stolen documents. Bank staff made the call. Johnson looked Margaret over, his eyes pausing on the broken frame in her hands. His voice dropped. "You detained her over a withdrawal?" She got defensive. "Matched a fraud profile," Daniels muttered. Johnson stepped closer to Margaret. "Ma'am, are you able to confirm your identity in any other way?" Margaret inhaled slowly, then opened her wallet with precision. "My secondary ID is in the hidden compartment." She held it out toward Johnson. "Pull the tab. Read it carefully." Daniels snatched the wallet before Johnson could take it, fumbling with the inner fold, pulling out a laminated government-issued identification card. He looked at it, at first without comprehension. Then his face went slack. He read aloud, slowly. "Emergency contact. Elijah Thompson, U.S. Attorney General." The silence that followed was absolute. Miller squinted at Daniels. "What did you just say?" Daniels didn't answer. His face had paled. He passed the card to Miller, who read the line twice, his lips moving wordlessly. This can't be real." Johnson looked between the two of them. "Are you telling me this woman's son is the Attorney General of the United States?" Margaret didn't blink. "I told you. You'd regret this." Daniel swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how tight his collar felt. We need to verify this," he said quickly. "Standard procedure." Miller took a step back, his posture more cautious now. "There's gotta be a mistake. People fake stuff like this all the time." Johnson shook his head slowly. "This ID's not fake. I've seen these before. They're federal-issue family clearances. You don't just forge these." Daniels forced a chuckle, but it sounded hollow. "Ma'am, perhaps we misunderstood the situation earlier." "Perhaps," Margaret replied coolly, her voice sharp and measured. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She let the silence between her words do the work. Daniels gestured vaguely toward her scattered belongings. "Let us help you gather your things." Margaret didn't move. She watched them like a judge in a courtroom, giving them just enough rope to hang themselves. Inside the bank, the shift was visible. Sandra, who had once stood smug and folded-armed behind the glass, now looked pale. The bank manager had reappeared, hovering near Brian, who stared at the unfolding scene with wide eyes. Brian whispered, "What if she's really someone important?" The manager didn't respond. His attention was on the television behind the teller windows, where a breaking news banner had appeared. "DOJ motorcade en route to local bank. Sources say Attorney General's mother petered." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. Outside, Miller held the ID like it might burn him. "What if she's bluffing?" he asked quietly. "She's not bluffing," Johnson replied. "And if this gets confirmed..." Daniels checked his phone. Messages were coming in, rapid fire, panicked. Then his radio crackled again. A dispatcher's voice came through, tense and tight. Be advised, DOJ aircraft has departed Andrews. Estimated arrival in your airspace within the hour. Possible VIP transport. Daniels closed his eyes. Oh, hell. Margaret said nothing. She bent down calmly, picked up her reading glasses, her lipstick, and her checkbook from where they still lay scattered on the hood. She left the broken frame on the pavement, but pocketed the photo. It was the only thing she needed to carry into the storm about to hit. The whine of jet engines filled the air above the airstrip just outside town. A black government plane touched down, its wheels screeching briefly against the tarmac. The seal of the United States Department of Justice gleamed near the front of the fuselage. As the plane rolled to a halt, a convoy of SUVs waited. Doors opened, agents stepped out, staffers scrambled. But the man who emerged from the plane last walked with a steady fury that cleared a path without a word. Elijah Thompson descended the stairs, eyes hidden behind dark glasses, suit sharp, movements precise. He spoke into his earpiece without breaking stride. "Send me the live feed from her phone. I want everything. Audio, visual, time-stamped." A staffer handed him a tablet. As he slid into the waiting SUV, the screen lit up with synced footage from the moment Margaret had pressed the button. He watched the entire sequence, the mocking voices, the disbelief, the shove against the cruiser, the laughter when they stepped on her ID. The vehicle accelerated, leading the convoy toward the heart of Pine Ridge. Elijah didn't look up from the screen until he saw the moment where Officer Miller picked up the broken family photo and sneered. His voice was quiet. "Pull DOJ authorization to lock down the bank and the police department. I want both under federal observation before we arrive." A second voice replied through the earpiece. "Already done, sir." The convoy tore through the streets, lights flashing, sirens silent. No need for spectacle. The gravity of the situation was weight enough. As they approached the edge of town, federal agents were already setting up a perimeter around the First National Bank branch. Tape was drawn, observers were pulled aside. Cameras clicked from every corner of the parking lot as reporters rushed to cover the event. Inside the bank, panic had taken hold. Sandra tried to explain herself to the regional manager. "She didn't look like someone with that much money. It's not my fault." She matched the fraud algorithm. The manager snapped. "You called the police on $1 million client because of a gut feeling?" Outside, the officers watched the crowd swell. Daniels' phone buzzed again. This time, a call from the chief. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Margaret stood by the patrol car, untouched now, observed, untouchable. The same woman they had dismissed had become the storm's epicenter. And then the convoy turned the corner. Daniels turned in time to see the black SUVs roll into the lot, federal agents stepping out in synchronized motion. Doors opened. Elijah Thompson stepped out, eyes burning behind his sunglasses. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't wave to the press. He looked straight at his mother. Margaret gave the faintest nod. The photo was still in her hand. Elijah crossed the lot. The officers stood frozen. Daniels opened his mouth. "Sir, we were just—" Elijah didn't acknowledge him. He walked past the officer like he didn't exist. When he reached his mother, he stopped. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "No, but others will be." And behind them, the full weight of the Department of Justice descended. The scene outside First National Bank had changed dramatically. The moment the convoy pulled in, a ripple moved through the growing crowd like an electric current. What had started as a few curious onlookers and a handful of cell phones had now evolved into a full-blown public spectacle. Bystanders stood on sidewalks. Customers who had left the bank earlier returned when they saw black SUVs with government plates roll up. Reporters from the local news station arrived just in time to catch the scene unfold. Cameras rolled, mics were raised. A young woman across the street live-streamed on her phone. "They're harassing a sweet old lady outside the bank," she said, her voice tight with outrage. "Y'all, look at this. She's just standing there and they got her surrounded like she's a criminal." She turned the camera toward Margaret, standing quietly in her pressed blouse and pearl earrings, hands folded, face calm. The caption beneath the stream read, "Banking while black." In minutes, the video was shared across platforms, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. It jumped from 10 views to 1,000, then 10,000, then more. Inside the bank, Sandra watched the screen of her phone flood with notifications. Her face tightened as she recognized herself in the background of the video clip, arms crossed, silent, watching it all happen. She glanced toward the door, just in time to see the first wave of DOJ agents step into the lobby. Elijah Thompson hadn't even said a word yet, but his presence was enough to stop time. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his expression unreadable, his movements deliberate. When he stepped onto the pavement outside, Daniel stiffened. Miller took 2 steps back, his eyes scanning for an escape that didn't exist. Margaret stood where they'd left her, her back straight, her son approaching like the storm they'd never expected. Elijah walked past the officers without acknowledging them. His eyes were locked on the front doors of the bank. Agents fanned out behind him, some entering the lobby, others securing the perimeter. Reporters jostled for position. The red light of a live broadcast camera blinked steadily in the background. Elijah paused at the glass doors, then stepped inside. The atmosphere changed instantly. Customers fell silent, staff froze. Brian lowered his eyes. Sandra swallowed hard. The branch manager stood near the front desk, wiping sweat from his brow. Elijah's voice was low, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "Who escalated this?" Sandra's lips parted. It was my call. She didn't seem trustworthy." Elijah took 1 step closer. "Did she raise her voice? Did she present valid ID?" "Yes, but..." "Did she threaten anyone?" Sandra stammered. "No, sir, but she wanted to withdraw a large amount. It matched a fraud pattern." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "And the pattern was what exactly?" "Black woman, over 60, calm voice, good credit." Sandra didn't answer, her jaw clenched as Elijah turned away from her. She exhaled, thinking perhaps the worst was over, but then he stopped at the front counter, where Brian stood frozen behind the glass. "You're the teller who served her?" Elijah asked. Brian nodded. Yes, sir." "You verified her ID?" "I looked at it, but I wasn't sure. I asked Sandra to review it." Elijah's voice stayed even. "So, she handed over her ID, you examined it, and rather than complete her withdrawal, you flagged her to management and called the police?" Brian nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Brian hesitated. "She didn't look like someone who'd withdraw that much. It just seemed suspicious." A murmur ran through the lobby. One of the customers, a middle-aged black man in a suit, shook his head and stepped back. Another customer whispered something to her daughter, who looked at Sandra with wide, questioning eyes. Elijah turned to the branch manager. "Who's in charge here?" The man stepped forward. "I am, Gregory Turner." "Mr. Turner, are you aware that my mother has been a premium client of this bank for over 30 years? That she has over $1.2 million in this account? That she's made large quarterly withdrawals for charitable and educational purposes for over a decade?" Gregory's face paled. I didn't know. I wasn't informed." "She didn't just walk in off the street. She didn't ask for a handout. She asked for her money. From an account she owns, and you treated her like a threat." Gregory swallowed hard. "Mr. Thompson, I assure you, this isn't standard protocol." "I'm not here for assurances," Elijah cut in. "I'm here for accountability." Outside, the crowd had spilled past the parking lot. People were filming, others were asking questions. "What's going on? Who is she? Why are federal agents here?" Inside, Elijah nodded once to one of the DOJ officials behind him. The man stepped forward and spoke clearly. "By order of the United States Department of Justice, this branch is now under federal review. All activity, correspondence, surveillance footage, and employee records are to be preserved immediately. No staff are to leave the premises without clearance." Sandra gasped. "Wait, what? We didn't... This was all a misunderstanding?" Elijah turned back to her slowly. "You called the police on a woman you didn't believe deserved the money in her own account. That's not a misunderstanding, that's discrimination." She stepped forward slightly, her voice rising. "We were just doing our job." He stared at her. "You assaulted the woman who raised me. The only reason you're not in handcuffs is because she values grace over revenge." Margaret had stepped quietly into the lobby by then, her photo still in her hand. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Margaret stood at the edge of the lobby, her presence causing the room to still once again. Customers looked at her differently now, not as the suspect she'd been portrayed as, but as someone of importance, someone they had underestimated, someone whose quiet strength now overshadowed the uniforms, the badges, the suits. The branch manager approached slowly. "Mrs. Thompson, I deeply regret how you were treated here today. This is not who we are." Margaret didn't smile. "It is exactly who you are. But now the world is watching." Gregory tried to maintain composure. "Your account is in perfect standing. I can personally complete the withdrawal." Elijah raised a hand. "No. This branch is now under investigation. There will be no further transactions here until that's complete." Margaret nodded in agreement. "I don't need my money today. I need justice." Brian stepped out from behind the counter. His voice was low but audible. "It was Sandra. She made the call. I was unsure, but she escalated it." Sandra turned toward him, her face stricken. "Brian..." He looked at her directly. "We work in banking. We're supposed to deal in facts, not assumptions. What we did to her was wrong." A federal agent took Sandra by the arm gently. "Please, come with me. We'll begin our questioning now." She looked back at Elijah, then Margaret. "Please," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." Margaret met her eyes. "It always goes too far for people like me. You just never thought it would matter." The DOJ officials moved swiftly. Agents logged into terminals. Surveillance footage was backed up. Employee computers were seized for review. The bank, once humming with casual efficiency, now functioned like a crime scene. Outside, the press gathered. The footage from earlier now had over 2 million views. Headlines flashed across national news. Attorney General's mother profiled at bank. Federal investigation launched. Justice Department descends on Pine Ridge. In the lobby, Elijah leaned in close to Margaret. "You sure you're okay?" She smiled faintly. "I'm not shaken. I'm focused. Let's make sure the next woman who walks into a bank like this doesn't need a son in high office to be treated like she belongs." He nodded. "Then we begin here." Margaret looked around one last time at the branch where her name had been doubted, her face questioned, her existence undermined. Now, that same place was under federal lock and key. She turned toward the crowd forming outside the glass. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't an exception. She was the mirror, and the whole country was about to see its reflection. The private jet touched down 2 hours after Elijah Thompson locked down the branch. The sun had moved higher in the sky, but the tension blanketing the First National Bank building had only grown heavier. A black luxury sedan pulled up in front of the taped-off entrance, and from it stepped Harrison Edwards, CEO of First National Bank. His suit was immaculate, his gold cufflinks glinting in the sunlight, but even his practiced smile looked brittle under the weight of what he had just flown into. He adjusted his tie and approached the bank with the air of a man used to controlling rooms, silencing questions with charm and turning crises into manageable talking points. But as he passed through the doors and saw the DOJ agents reviewing files, the federal officials interviewing employees, and the cameras still flashing through the glass, his confidence faltered. He found Elijah standing near the central desk, quietly reviewing a list of flagged accounts on a DOJ tablet. Margaret sat off to the side, sipping tea that one of the agents had offered her. She looked every bit the composed woman they had underestimated, her expression unreadable. Harrison extended a hand. "Attorney General Thompson, I flew in the moment I was briefed. Please allow me to say, this is a regrettable misunderstanding." Elijah didn't take his hand. He looked him straight in the eyes. "It's not a misunderstanding. It's systemic failure." Harrison's jaw tightened. "We certainly acknowledge that the incident should have been handled differently and will ensure that appropriate corrective actions are—" Elijah cut him off. "Let me stop you right there. This is not just about your employees mishandling one situation. This is about a culture that allowed them to believe that mishandling it was the default." He gestured to the DOJ staff behind him. "Our investigators pulled 7 complaints from this branch in the last 12 months, all settled quietly, all involving Black or elderly clients. Your branch manager flagged them as anomalies. Our data says otherwise." Harrison hesitated. "Those were reviewed internally. They were isolated." "No," Elijah replied, sliding the tablet across the desk. "They weren't. We've now identified 27 similar cases across your branches nationwide. Same tactics, same profile triggers, same outcome, humiliation and delay." The room was still. Harrison glanced at the screen. His throat moved as he swallowed hard. Margaret stood and walked toward them, calm and unhurried. When she spoke, her voice was low but resonant. "You think the problem is the public relations fallout. It's not. The problem is the rot you ignored because it didn't affect anyone who looked like you." Harrison opened his mouth, then closed it. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes level with his, her presence suddenly the most commanding force in the room. "I know who you are, Mr. Edwards," she said, "and you don't know me, but you should." He blinked. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Thompson," she finished for him. "Margaret Thompson." She reached into her purse, pulled out a small navy leather business card case, and drew out a single card. She handed it to him. Harrison glanced at it, then stared. The color drained slightly from his face. She continued, her voice growing in strength. "Former Chief Financial Officer of Westland Industries, founder of the Thompson Foundation, member of the Federal Reserve Advisory Council, and yes, mother of the Attorney General of the United States." The room was utterly still. The agents, the bank staff, the reporters who had just entered behind the security cordon, they all stood frozen as the weight of her words settled over the room. Margaret turned slightly, addressing the room. "I started as a bank teller in 1968. I balanced ledgers by hand and stayed up late helping my son with homework while studying for my finance certification. I worked 2 jobs and buried a husband who died too young. I built my credit the hard way, I built my wealth the slow way, and I never once asked for anything I hadn't earned." She stepped back beside her son, her hand steady as she slipped the card case away. "This system," she continued, "was built on my labor. Women like me did the work. We weren't in the commercials, we weren't in the boardrooms, but we were in the vaults and the ledgers and the break rooms, and now you dare question if we belong?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The silence it created was louder than shouting. Harrison shifted on his feet. "Mrs. Thompson, She raised a hand. "You don't need to say anything else. What you need to do now is listen." She turned to the federal agents. "How many of your flagged cases were settled with non-disclosure agreements?" A DOJ investigator replied without hesitation. "All 7 local cases were NDA sealed. Several of the national cases were too, but we've started lifting those clauses under federal authority." Margaret nodded. "Good, because what you've buried is now unearthed." Harrison stood there, no longer a CEO in control but a man caught in the collapse of an illusion he had maintained too long. His PR team, huddled near the entrance, said nothing. No one could spin what had just happened. Elijah stepped forward, taking control once more. We've initiated a full federal audit into your bank's withdrawal protocol patterns, transaction flags, and internal reporting systems. The DOJ is formally requesting access to your algorithmic flagging models. Harrison exhaled. That's proprietary technology. Elijah cut him off. So is discrimination, apparently. We've also contacted the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Federal Reserve for joint review. Harrison's voice faltered. All at once? Yes, Elijah said, because your culture of bias doesn't deserve staggered accountability. A young DOJ analyst stepped forward, tablet in hand. Sir, we've now pulled documentation from this branch, suggesting that customers flagged for unusual withdrawals were disproportionately elderly and non-white. No such correlation exists in your fraud case history, but the withdrawal delays and call escalations match. Harrison looked cornered. We followed protocol. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Your protocol is the problem. Outside, the protest had grown. Local community members had gathered with signs that read "Justice for Miss Margaret" and "Dignity shouldn't require power." Former students of hers stood near the sidewalk, many of them now parents and professionals themselves. Reporters surrounded the scene. The video from earlier had now reached over 5 million views. The caption had been updated, "She's not just a customer, she wrote the rules they violated." Inside, Harrison's phone buzzed, a text from the board, then another, then another. He glanced at the screen and the color drained further. Margaret turned to Elijah. How long before the markets react? He shrugged. I'd say by market close, but investors are probably already dumping shares. Good, she replied softly. Harrison looked up, straining for composure. We'll make this right. We'll issue a formal apology. No, Elijah said. You'll submit to full regulatory oversight. You'll review every discriminatory incident, not just mine. And you'll do it transparently. No more settlements. No more sealed complaints. Harrison nodded slowly. And what about Sandra? Margaret answered this time. Her actions will be evaluated with the rest, but whether she's fired or not is irrelevant. You can't fix culture by firing one person. You fix it by dismantling the system that allowed it to thrive. The room remained silent. The dominoes had begun to fall, and there was no stopping the collapse now. Margaret stepped forward one last time, looking Harrison in the eyes. I'm not angry, she said. I'm not bitter. I'm awake, and I won't close my eyes again. She turned and walked out of the bank, past the cameras, past the agents, and into the crowd that now waited not just for justice, but for change. The podium was small, but the silence surrounding it was immense. Cameras buzzed, reporters leaned forward. The crowd stretched from the courthouse steps down to the sidewalk, and traffic had stopped just to watch. Elijah Thompson stood there, not as the son of Margaret Thompson, not as the child of a woman who had been dragged and humiliated outside a bank, but as the Attorney General of the United States. The seal of the Department of Justice gleamed behind him, and the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in attendance. He didn't begin with a thank you. He didn't ease into it. His voice was measured, firm, unshaking. This is no longer just about a single incident at First National Bank, he said. This is about a system that routinely and unapologetically treats Black Americans as suspects before it sees them as citizens. A hush rippled through the audience. In homes across the country, televisions blinked on. Live streams hit hundreds of thousands of viewers in minutes. Hashtags began to form. News tickers scrolled beneath every major network. This wasn't local anymore. It wasn't even just personal. It was national. My mother, Elijah continued, is 72 years old. She built wealth, honestly. She mentored students. She served her country in silence, and still, she was seen, not as a client, not as a woman of honor, but as a threat, because of the color of her skin. He paused, not for drama, but because the truth itself required breath. The reporters didn't dare ask questions yet. No one moved. In response, he said slowly, "The Department of Justice is launching a national investigation into race-based financial discrimination in American banking institutions, beginning with First National Bank and its 37 branches that have recorded complaints of profiling and unequal treatment. We will audit, subpoena, prosecute, and reform where necessary, and we will not stop until every person, regardless of race, age, or appearance, can walk into a bank and be treated like a human being." Applause didn't come right away. The gravity of the statement needed time to sink in, but when it did, when the audience began to process what had just been announced, it came like thunder. Reporters scrambled, microphones clashed, a dozen hands flew up, voices shouted questions over one another. The nation had been waiting for a statement like this, for a reckoning like this, and it had arrived. Elijah stepped back from the podium. His security team moved to shield him, but he raised a hand. Not yet. He turned to look out over the crowd. He was searching. And then he saw her. Margaret stood beneath the shade of a wide tree, a hand on her cane, her chin high. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't wanted cameras, agents, or national headlines. All she had asked for was her own money, her own dignity. Their eyes met. A quiet acknowledgement passed between them, a look that said, "You did it. You turned humiliation into truth, and the world will never look away again." Elijah turned back to the press with one final remark. "Let me be clear," he said. "This isn't just about justice for Margaret Thompson. This is about the thousands of people whose stories never made it to a microphone. We hear you, we see you, and this time, we are not walking away." He left the podium. No questions, no politics, just truth. Back inside the federal van parked near the bank, DOJ investigators were already downloading security footage, logging statements from bank employees, and scanning digital records. The entire First National network was now under scrutiny. Calls were being made to branches in Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, and Oakland. What had happened here was not isolated. It was symptomatic. Inside the bank lobby, the tension was suffocating. The local branch manager, visibly sweating, tried to act cooperative. "We're fully prepared to assist," he said, but his voice cracked. DOJ staff didn't respond. They were too busy photographing documents and sealing computers. In a glass-walled conference room at the rear, Sandra sat alone. Her eyes were red. Her posture collapsed inward. The weight of her choices, of the words she had spoken, the tone she had taken, the judgment she had passed, was no longer a matter of customer service. It was now a matter of federal inquiry, and for the first time since Margaret had walked through her doors, she was speechless. Across town, the ripple had already begun. Black business owners pulled up their transaction records. Retirees dug through statements from denied loans. College students posted videos about their own uncomfortable encounters with tellers, managers, and silent stares. The voice Elijah had just used was not speaking only for his mother. It had activated something deeper, something old, something long buried under the weight of being told again and again that maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But this time, the misunderstanding had gone viral, and it was being answered with power. Officer Daniels sat in the break room of the precinct, staring at the muted TV screen. His name was already running across the news ticker. Officer Paul Daniels placed on administrative leave, pending DOJ investigation. Just hours ago, he had felt untouchable, confident enough to mock an elderly woman on a sidewalk. Now, the world was watching, and it was replaying every second of that footage. Beside him, Officer Miller paced in small, agitated circles. His phone buzzed nonstop. Friends, reporters, union reps, but he ignored them all. His mind was racing back to all the other times he'd handled things the same way, all the complaints that had been dismissed, all the customers he'd brushed off. What if they came back? At a separate table, Officer Johnson sat quietly, hands folded, eyes down. He had already made his choice. That morning he'd walked into Internal Affairs and asked to speak with a DOJ investigator. "I want to cooperate," he had said. "I didn't sign up to protect bias. I signed up to protect people." Body cam footage from past incidents was already being reviewed. Patterns were emerging. Same officers, same tones, same assumptions. The paper trail was no longer invisible. And for the first time in their careers, Daniels and Miller weren't the ones asking questions. They were the ones being investigated. Inside the towering glass headquarters of First National Bank, chaos had taken root. The trading floor was silent except for the flicker of stock tickers plummeting in red. The bank's shares had dropped by 18% in a single day, and Wall Street wasn't finished reacting. Harrison Edwards, the CEO, who had once boasted of untouchable stability, now stood in front of a boardroom full of furious shareholders demanding answers. "This isn't about one branch," a gray-haired board member snapped, slamming a printed DOJ complaint report on the table. "This is about our culture, about decades of looking the other way." Harrison raised his hands, trying to speak. "We are cooperating fully. We will address this." "You're not listening," another director interrupted, her voice tight. "You don't get to fix this. You allowed it. You protected it." As word of the scandal spread, other banks began issuing nervous press releases. Civil rights attorneys flooded social media. And outside the branch where it all began, the sidewalk had transformed. Margaret sat beneath a blue canopy as the sun began to set. Former students, grown men, and women stood around her, holding handmade signs. "Justice for Miss Margaret. She taught me to read. She taught us to stand." A young woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "You held my hand in third grade when I was scared. Let me hold yours now." Margaret took it, her hand weathered but steady. Across town, more Black residents came forward with their own stories. Accounts of delayed loan approvals, unusual identification checks, cold refusals masked as policy. Stories that had once been told in hushed tones were now being spoken into microphones and echoed across the nation. For the first time in years, silence was no longer protecting the system. It was exposing it. It began in a glass-walled conference room in Washington, D.C. Days after the incident, the Department of Justice assembled a special task force under the direct guidance of Attorney General Elijah Thompson. The footage of Margaret's detainment had become more than viral. It had become a catalyst. The public didn't just want justice, they wanted prevention. They wanted structure. They wanted the system to acknowledge what it had never dared speak aloud, that banking discrimination was real, was rampant, and could no longer be ignored. Policy analysts, civil rights attorneys, economists, and community organizers sat around the long table as Elijah stood at the head, holding a single sheet of paper. On it, written in bold, were 3 words: "Never again protocol." He looked at them and said, "What happened to my mother isn't just a one-off. It's a symptom of design. Let's dismantle that design." And from that meeting came 3 proposals that would shake the banking industry to its core. The first was the most immediate: blind transaction reviews. No longer could a teller view a customer's race, age, or address before verifying large transactions. All high-dollar withdrawals would go through a protected internal review that relied solely on account data, not appearance. The second reform centered on power to the people, community oversight panels. Each bank branch in qualifying cities would now be subject to quarterly audits led by a panel of local citizens, civil rights leaders, and former financial professionals. These panels could escalate patterns of discrimination directly to the DOJ without waiting for lawsuits or viral outrage. The final piece of legislation, co-authored with Senator Ramirez of New York, was introduced to Congress as the Banking Equality Act. It proposed federal protections against financial discrimination based on race, age, or zip code, and carried enforcement teeth that could penalize entire institutions, not just individuals. The reforms didn't come without resistance. Several banking lobbies mobilized instantly. One executive called it financial affirmative action, but they underestimated the force of the public. People had seen Margaret. They had heard her voice. They had watched her stand tall while others tried to erase her dignity. And in that, they saw their mothers, grandmothers, and sisters. Margaret hadn't spoken much since the press conference, but her presence echoed in every chamber these policies entered. She didn't need to raise her voice. The world had finally started listening. Margaret sat by her window, a cup of chamomile tea resting in her hands, the steam curling like whispered memories. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns onto the hardwood floor. It had been 2 weeks since that day at the bank, but the world hadn't quieted. Reporters still camped outside from time to time, and neighbors came by with flowers, cards, or just to say thank you. But today, she asked for stillness. On the table beside her sat a stack of letters, handwritten, typed, some smudged with tears, others with children's drawings tucked inside. One was from a retired teacher in Georgia who had also been profiled while trying to cash her pension check. Another came from a young black banker in Chicago, saying Margaret's story gave him the courage to challenge his own institution's biased training manuals. One, in crayon, simply said, "Miss Margaret, you are my hero." She traced her fingers along the paper. Each word was a thread in a growing tapestry of healing and awakening. And in the quiet of her living room, Margaret began to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to touch since the day of the assault. Peace. She closed her eyes and thought of Elijah as a boy, standing on a step stool in the kitchen asking questions far too big for his age. "Mama, why do banks treat people like numbers?" he'd asked once. She'd ruffled his hair and said, "Because sometimes they forget people come first." And now, all these years later, her boy had become the man changing that truth. The kettle whistled again. Margaret stood slowly, joints stiff but heart steady. She walked over to the bookshelf, pulled out an old binder labeled Community Projects, and began flipping through yellowing pages of handwritten lesson plans from the ADS financial literacy workshops she once taught at the local church. That evening, Margaret placed a call to the director of the neighborhood senior center. Her voice, though gentle, carried certainty. "I'd like to teach a class again, just a small one, on budgeting, savings, and dignity." The woman on the other end choked up. "Miss Thompson, we'd be honored." So it began again, not from a courtroom or a headline, but from a circle of elders gathered around folding tables, notebooks open, pens ready. Margaret believed that empowerment didn't start with institutions, it started with stories, shared in quiet rooms, written in lined paper, carried in the hearts of people ready to believe that they deserved better. And this time they would have someone who knew the system, because she helped build it, and now she would help rebuild it the right way. Across town, the bank that once stood untouched by scrutiny had become a symbol of national shame. The corporate logo had been removed from the building's facade. The lobby was shuttered, windows covered, the once proud banners replaced with signs announcing a federal compliance investigation in progress. Employees entered in silence, escorted by DOJ observers who now occupied half the building. At headquarters in New York, Harrison Edwards, CEO of First National Bank, sat across from a special session of the board of directors. His suit was pressed, his jaw locked, but his voice betrayed him. "This has been a regrettable episode," he said, echoing the same corporate line he'd given when he first flew down to meet Elijah face to face. "I believe we acted swiftly and—" "You did not," one board member interrupted. "You dismissed it until it was on every screen in the country. Your first instinct was to protect the bank, not the people." Another member, a woman from the compliance committee, slid a folder across the table. 27 cases. You called them outliers. But they're a pattern, and patterns have consequences. The vote was swift. Harrison Edwards was removed as CEO by unanimous decision. His golden parachute severance package was frozen pending litigation. He left the room without shaking a single hand. Back at the local branch, Sandra sat across from a human resources investigator, arms crossed, a forced smile hiding the panic beneath. She had refused to take responsibility for the call she made, blamed confusion, training, even claimed she had felt threatened by Margaret's demeanor. But DOJ investigators had already pulled her internal messages. One chat log with Brian showed her mocking Margaret minutes before the incident. Another included a string of complaints filed by other black customers, many of which Sandra had laughed off in private notes to the branch manager. Lots and lots of animosity. The verdict came the next morning. Sandra was terminated for misconduct, racial bias, and breach of ethical policy. Her name was added to a national financial registry for discriminatory behavior. She wouldn't be working in any major institution again. As for Brian, the quiet teller who had originally served Margaret, he sat in a conference room with Elijah Thompson himself, nervous, unsure of why he'd been called in. "You told the truth," Elijah said simply, "and not just when it was easy. That matters." Brian blinked. I just did my job." "Exactly," Elijah nodded. "That's what we're looking for. People who do their jobs with integrity." Brian was promoted to head of community compliance. His new task? Overseeing equity training, reviewing staff behavior patterns, and helping rewrite the very manual that once enabled this abuse. His first act in the role? Recommending community liaisons be brought in to advise branches on how to serve diverse customers without bias or assumption. At Margaret's request, his first visit was to the senior center where her financial literacy class had just begun. She greeted him at the door with a gentle smile and a firm handshake. "Come in, Brian," she said. "You're just in time for the lesson." Inside, a dozen elders sat in folding chairs, notebooks open, pencils in hand. On the whiteboard, Margaret had written 5 words in bold letters. "Your dignity is your wealth." Brian sat quietly in the back row, watching her speak, not just as a student of finance, but as a student of strength. In that room, no one wore a title, no one carried a badge or wielded a gavel. There was only one currency, and that was truth. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt the balance begin to shift. Not through vengeance or spectacle, but through something far more lasting. Restoration. The sunlight poured in through the tall windows of the new First National branch, now rebranded and redesigned from the ground up. No more cold gray counters, no more glass barriers, no more glares from behind bulletproof partitions. This space felt warm, open, human. Plants in every corner, community artwork framed on the walls, some of it painted by local high school students. The smell of fresh paint still clung to the air, but so did something else, something heavier. A kind of reverent silence, like walking through a place where something sacred had happened. Margaret Thompson stepped through the doors, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. She wore a blue silk scarf tucked neatly into her coat and carried a small leather handbag, one that had once been emptied onto the hood of a cruiser like trash. But today, no one looked at her like that. Today, the room paused for her. The young teller behind the front desk was the first to react. She was black, maybe 19 or 20, her braids pulled into a high bun. Her name tag read Amari. She blinked, recognizing Margaret from the dozens of framed headlines on the wall in the bank's new history section. Then she smiled, not forced, not hesitant, a full, glowing smile like the kind you give your own grandmother when she walks into the room. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Amari said with a bright, sincere voice. "It's an honor to finally meet you. We've all been hoping you'd stop by." Margaret's eyes softened. She placed her hands gently on the counter, taking in the moment. "I thought I'd see what all the fuss was about," she said with a wry smile. Amari chuckled. "Well, you helped redesign it, whether you meant to or not. Everything changed because of you." A bank manager emerged from the office to greet her. This time it wasn't someone scrambling to cover a mistake. It was a woman named Carla Herrera, Latina, 40-ish, in a soft gray blazer and sneakers. She extended a hand but then paused, asking gently, "May I give you a hug instead?" Margaret nodded and they embraced. "We've built something different here," Carla said. "Diverse hiring, mandatory bias training, anonymous account reviews. No more individual discretion on large withdrawals. We're trying to make this a place where everyone belongs." Margaret looked around again, the people, the colors, the warmth. She smiled and whispered, "It feels like the future walked in." Back in Washington, D.C., the Department of Justice had become a different kind of machine, less reactive, more resolute. What began as a single investigation into one discriminatory banking incident had bloomed into a full-scale national initiative. The Banking Discrimination Task Force, once a line item buried in policy memos, now had its own department, its own press office, and most importantly, its own power. Elijah Thompson stood at the podium for a press conference marking the task force's one-year anniversary. Behind him stood victims who had come forward, retired veterans denied home loans, single mothers refused mortgages without explanation, small business owners stalled by unusual document reviews. Their faces, young, old, Black, Latino, Southeast Asian, told the real story. It wasn't just about Margaret. It never had been. She had lit the match. But the fire was fed by thousands. "In the past 12 months, Elijah began, we have recovered over $500 million in unlawful fees, denied accounts, and discriminatory lending practices. We have opened investigations into 3 major financial institutions, each of which has shown a repeated pattern of racial and socioeconomic bias." Flashbulbs popped. Reporters shouted questions, but Elijah stayed focused, calm. "We are not here to ruin banks," he continued. "We are here to rebuild trust. We are here to ensure that when a mother walks into a branch, whether she's wearing pearls or a hoodie, she is treated with dignity, with fairness, and with the full protection of the law." The public response had been overwhelming. Tens of thousands of citizens had submitted complaints after Margaret's story aired. Stories flooded in from cities like Detroit, Houston, Miami, and even small rural towns, each one echoing the same refrain. "They looked at me like I didn't belong." Congress had noticed. Banking CEOs had noticed, but most of all, people had noticed. In Newark, a community credit union saw a 200% increase in applications from Black families after revising its lending algorithm under DOJ guidance. In Atlanta, a bank hired a new department head specifically tasked with reviewing discriminatory practices, and that head was a former victim of one herself. In Chicago, a billboard rose over the freeway with a message in bold: "This is your money, this is your dignity. We protect both." Change was happening, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. And yet, even with the victories, Elijah knew the work wasn't finished. He returned to his office after the press conference and opened a thick file. Inside were dozens of testimonies, some anonymous, some signed with trembling handwriting, stories of humiliation, of denied dignity, of people who'd walked into banks and walked out smaller than they came in. He closed the file and stared out the window for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone and called his mother. When she answered, her voice carried that same calm, warm strength that had steadied him all his life. "Hey, Mama," he said. "The president's team just called. They want to use your case to push new legislation. Something sweeping, something lasting." Margaret's pause on the other end wasn't hesitation, it was reverence. "Well then," she said softly, "let's build something that outlives us both." Spring came early that year. The cherry blossoms bloomed along the mall in Washington, D.C., and in a quiet corner of the city, Margaret Thompson stood outside a modest lecture hall bearing a new name: the Margaret L. Thompson Center for Economic Dignity. She looked up at the engraved plaque, her fingers grazing the cold metal. Elijah stood beside her. No suit today, just a simple button down, a nod to humility. Her grandson Isaiah was there too, taller than before, with that quiet fire in his eyes, the same one Elijah had when he was young. The boy had just started his first semester at Howard University. His scholarship had been fully funded by the Thompson Foundation, but he never once asked for special treatment. He wanted to earn everything, just like his grandmother. The ribbon was cut by a young girl from Southeast DCC, a 7th grader whose family had been one of the first to benefit from the new community banking initiative. She smiled as she handed Margaret a bouquet. "My mama says you changed everything," she whispered. Margaret just hugged her and said, "We changed it together, baby." Inside, the walls were lined with portraits, not just of Margaret, but of every woman who had stood up against economic injustice. Black women who had fought for equal pay, Latina organizers who had exposed predatory lenders, Asian American advocates who had written financial literacy programs from scratch. The center wasn't about one person, it was about memory, and it was about momentum. At the opening ceremony, Elijah took the podium once more, but this time he didn't speak as Attorney General. He spoke as a son. "My mother never asked for a platform," he said. "She asked for decency. She asked for truth. And when those things were denied to her, she didn't break. She didn't scream. She waited. And when the time came, she stood." The audience was silent. Some were crying. Even the reporters put their cameras down. "She showed me," he continued, "that real power doesn't need to yell. It just needs to exist, long enough, loudly enough that the world finally hears it." Margaret smiled softly, blinking back tears. Not out of sorrow, but out of something deeper, recognition. Her voice, once dismissed, now echoed in halls of power. Later that day, Margaret returned home. Her house smelled of jasmine tea and sunlight. She walked past her garden, where the roses had started to bloom again. In her den, letters were stacked in neat bundles. Thank you notes, testimonials, and stories from strangers who no longer felt invisible. She sat down at her desk, pulled out a fresh notebook, and began outlining her next class. She had decided to offer a free online course for senior citizens on navigating modern banking systems. "We're too old to be fooled," she wrote on the title page, "and too wise to be quiet." Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, Margaret dipped her pen again and kept writing. Because her work wasn't done. It never really would be. But now, at last, it was being heard. The Senate hearing chamber was full. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, the nation watching live. The marble walls seemed to echo with a kind of reverence, but also tension. This wasn't just another hearing, it was history. At the center sat Elijah Thompson, U.S. Attorney General, steady, composed, and sharpened by purpose. But the real strength sat directly behind him, Margaret Thompson. In a navy blue suit, hands folded, chin held high, she didn't need to speak to be heard. A senator leaned forward, microphone live. "Attorney General Thompson, walk us through the failure. From a legal standpoint, what went wrong?" Elijah didn't hesitate. It started with a phone call placed by a biased employee who lacked training, oversight, and restraint. It escalated due to law enforcement's failure to de-escalate. It became national because it was not an isolated incident. The systemic failure here is not accidental, it's cultural, and it requires structural change. He tapped a file in front of him. "We've compiled reports from over 40 states, cases of financial profiling, denial of service, harassment based on nothing more than a customer's appearance. What happened to my mother is part of a broader trend that has festered beneath the surface for decades." The room stilled as Margaret gently placed a single sheet of paper beside him. He glanced at it. It was a photograph. The bank, that day. Her sitting on the bench, purse open, papers scattered, Daniels towering over her with contempt on his face. The image had already gone viral, but here, in front of lawmakers, it meant something more. It was a moment frozen in time, a reminder of how easily dignity could be stripped from someone who had earned it tenfold. The chairman of the committee adjusted his glasses. And what became of the officer in that image, Agent Daniels? Elijah paused. He was removed from duty and now works private security at a mall in Georgia. But I believe the deeper question isn't about punishment. It's about transformation, which is why we've drafted legislation that ensures mandatory anti-bias training, national accountability audits, and federal oversight in high-risk banking zones. He turned slightly, allowing the camera to capture Margaret in full view behind him. But no policy will matter if we don't restore the basic promise of fairness, not just for Margaret Thompson, but for every person who's ever been made to feel like less, simply for walking through a bank's front door. Margaret didn't flinch. Her presence alone was louder than any speech. She wasn't there for revenge. She wasn't even there to watch Edward squirm, though he sat across the room now, pale and sweaty, trying not to meet her gaze. She was there for the future. And for the first time in decades, the Senate chamber felt like a place where something permanent might be born. The legislation passed faster than anyone expected. It was called the Dignity Banking Act, and for once it wasn't just a name, it meant something. The act mandated that all financial institutions implement a national customer fairness protocol. It required anonymous ID verification to reduce profiling, DOJ tracking of demographic service data, and a 24-hour hotline for reporting abuse at banks. The hotline didn't just go live, it lit up. Within the first month, more than 9,000 reports were filed. Banks scrambled to train staff. For some institutions, the change came reluctantly, pushed by fear of litigation. For others, it became a point of pride. Community branches started holding listening sessions. "Tell us your story," they asked. For once, the customers had the floor. And then came the ripple effects. Insurance companies began revising bias clauses. Mortgage lenders launched fairness reviews. The DOJ launched regional field teams to perform surprise equity audits. In 2 states, class action lawsuits moved forward, citing racial discrimination at a level so persistent it had become invisible to those who benefited from it. But it wasn't invisible anymore. Margaret's name was in every headline, not as a victim, but as the turning point. While the country debated reform on news panels and social media, Margaret moved quietly through her own community as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Twice a week, she taught a class at the community center, financial literacy for seniors. The room was always full. Some came with notepads, others with memories they hadn't shared before. "I remember being denied a loan in 1982, one woman said. "They told me I didn't look like someone who could pay it back." The class nodded in silent understanding. Margaret didn't lecture, she listened. Then she showed them how to read the fine print, how to build savings, how to fight back without shouting. "Power," she said, "lives in knowledge." One Tuesday, a surprise visitor showed up. Sandra, the same woman who'd made the call at the bank. Her eyes were lower now, her tone humbler. "I've been assigned to teach bias recognition classes," she said, voice quiet. "They offered me a desk job, but I asked to be here. I want to do this right." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then pulled out an extra chair. "If you're willing to listen more than you talk," she said, "you're welcome." Sandra sat down beside the seniors. She didn't say much that first class, but she didn't need to. The first step in change is showing up. Meanwhile, across the country, people like Officer Daniels found themselves in unexpected places. Mall security wasn't the career he'd envisioned, but it became the crucible for something deeper. One afternoon, he watched as another security guard began tailing a group of black teenagers for no reason. Daniels stepped in. "Let them shop," he said. "Unless they do something wrong, leave them alone." The younger guard blinked. "Why?" Daniels didn't raise his voice. "Because I didn't know better once. And now I do." He never told them why he intervened. He didn't need to. His eyes had changed. Margaret sat at her writing desk by the window, a soft beam of morning light pooling across the pages of her journal. Outside, the wind moved gently through the oak trees lining her street. She had just finished writing the last line of her memoir. The title was written in bold, graceful letters, Banking on Dignity. It wasn't a book about revenge. It wasn't even a book about policy. It was a story about quiet strength, about the generations of women who walked into rooms where they weren't wanted and stayed anyway. She didn't write it for fame. She wrote it for her grandson, for her students at the center, and for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. A knock came at the door. It was Brian, now officially promoted to head of community compliance. He handed her a photo and smiled. "It's up," he said. The picture showed the entrance of the very bank where everything began. Above the doors, in bronze lettering, was a new plaque. It read, "Dignity and respect for every customer, inspired by Margaret Thompson." Margaret stared at the photo for a long moment, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Not from age, from meaning. Later that afternoon, she visited the branch in person. The space was different now. Bright murals of diverse communities lined the walls. A children's reading corner had been added. The teller behind the desk greeted her not with forced politeness, but with genuine warmth. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," the young woman said. "Would you like some tea while you wait?" Margaret smiled. "No need. I'm not here to make a deposit." She paused, letting the sunlight pour through the glass panels overhead. "I'm here to witness the future." Behind her, a mother held her child's hand as they walked in. A man in a wheelchair rolled up to the counter and was greeted with full attention. Two seniors sat near the financial help desk, learning how to set up online banking. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. As Margaret stepped outside, she looked back one final time, not at the building, but at what it stood for now. Justice had never been about vengeance. It had always been about reform, about dignity, about restoring what should have never been lost. She walked down the steps slowly, with grace in every movement. Behind her, the plaque shimmered in the light. Margaret Thompson had not just changed a policy, she had changed a system, and in doing so she reminded a nation that dignity is not a favor granted by power, it is a right, one that belongs to everyone. Always.